Thanks to all of you who have already joined us on this webinar, which will be discussing the two toolkits released by the Center for HIV Law and Policy and the National LGBTQ Task Force in September of this year, which focus on the intersections between HIV criminalization and the criminalization of sex work and syringe use. Oops. So we have four speakers joining us today. We have Sasanka Janadasa and Kate Diadamo, both of whom are with Reframe Health and Justice. We have Megan Mori from the National LGBTQ Task Force. And my name is Kate Bolton. I'm with the Center for HIV Law and Policy. Everyone that you see here was involved at some point during the process of drafting the toolkits and seeking feedback on the toolkits. And so we're all excited to share them with you and talk about how they can inform your own advocacy.
Thanks so much, Kate. And before we come to this magical slide about the launch of the new advocacy toolkit, can we just go around the four of us and just tell people a little bit about how we come to this work? Kate, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I'm Kate Bolton. I'm a staff attorney at the Center for HIV Law and Policy. Most of my work is with the Positive Justice Project, which focuses on ending HIV criminalization. So that includes both work with state coalitions that are trying to modernize their laws, but also work on the broader strategy and thinking about HIV criminalization, for instance, through projects like this toolkit.
Awesome. And Kate D., do you want to go second?
Sure. Hi. I am a sex worker rights advocate, and I'm with Reframe Health and Justice. And my background is I was the national policy advocate for the Sex Workers Project, and before that, I was a community organizer for folks that traded sex in the New York metropolitan area. And now I do a lot of national and federal work around issues impacting people that trade sex, including prostitution laws, anti-trafficking laws, and then, of course, HIV criminalization.
Awesome. I love being on with such smart people. Sasanka, do you want to round us out?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Sasanka. I take they, them pronouns, and I'm also with Reframe Health and Justice, which is a collaborative of individuals who provide services around harm reduction, sex worker rights, drug user health, and equity and inclusion in the workplace, organizations, and a lot of other fun stuff. I come to this work as a harm reduction service provider and organizer for people who trade sex and use drugs. And I've been doing it for a few years. I started off as working with queer people of color, advocacy and organizing around the rights for LGBTQ people of color, and moved into harm reduction as a way that we could do the work right and also do the work effectively. So that's me.
Fabulous. And I'm Megan Mori. I'm the policy director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. I came to this project because I was working on syringe access policy advocacy and HIV criminalization policy advocacy, and was super excited about the concept of us bringing those two things together. And as we started having conversations among the folks on this call and a bunch of other organizations, folks said, you know, it would be really smart for us to be thinking about it with an even more broad conception and bring in the criminalization of sex work as well. So that's what we tried to do. And if you could go to the next slide, we worked together to create these two toolkits that I really like to think of as all part of one concept together, which is to think about the criminalization of HIV from a broader frame of thinking about how people living with HIV are criminalized. So what is it that is causing people living with HIV to have intersections with the criminal legal system, and in what ways is the criminal legal system actually criminalizing behaviors that reduce transmission risk? these are probably just the tip of the iceberg for folks, but what we try to do is really lay out a bunch of basic information and give people concrete steps to move forward with, and we'll talk about that throughout this webinar. Do you want to go to that next slide? Here are some of the organizations that have already signed on in support. Many of the folks on this webinar may be from other organizations that take a look at the information on here and want to put their logo up on here as supporting organizations as well. We strongly welcome folks to do that. But before we really jump into the substance, we were hoping to do a quick poll. Now, Kate, you might have to walk us through how to do the poll. Oh, look, it just popped up just magically like that. So if you're on the call, if you could just click, if you're on the internet looking at the webinar, if you could click the types of advocacy that you are or have been involved in this magic poll, and it'll give us a sense of who's on the call and what we might want to delve a little bit deeper into. We'll give people just a minute or two to do that. Kate, can you tell us, can you give us the early poll results?
Yeah, actually our PETA, our National Community Outreach Coordinator, is sort of the wizard behind the curtain with the poll. So she's going to be giving us this sort of real-time updates about what people are answering in the poll.
So hi everyone, this is our PETA at the Center for HIV Law and Policy. With about 70% of you having voted so far, we have 76% of you who have voted work in HIV criminal law reform, 43% work in sex work decriminalization, and 57% work in safe syringe access, with just one of you answering that none of these areas fit the work that you do.
That is the most exciting early poll results that I've ever heard, because it means that folks on this call are already engaged in these issue areas, and you're probably among the folks who can benefit most from thinking with us through the intersections. So, Kate, do we want to run into, Kate B, do you want to run into the next slide and start off with some of the information about what these toolkits cover?
Yes, I do. So thanks for the introduction, Megan. And yeah, the poll results are really exciting. I had expected that the majority of you would have had experience in HIV crim, but I'm really delighted that there's so many folks on the call who have also worked in the areas of sex work decrim and safe syringe access. So I think we'll have a really rich conversation. Just to sort of set the stage for the remainder of the webinar, since we are talking about expanding the scope of what it means when we talk about HIV criminal law reform and what HIV criminalization is, I'm just going to quickly give an overview of HIV criminalization, which should be probably pretty familiar to a lot of you. And so this map gives you the current landscape of HIV criminalization in the United States. The red states are states where there's some kind of HIV-specific law, whether that's for non-disclosure, whether it targets sex workers living with HIV, or for blood or organ donation or something like that. So you can see that it's well over half of states that have these kind of laws in place. The darker orange states are states where some kind of general criminal law has been used to target people living with HIV, for instance, reckless endangerment or aggravated assault. And the states with the little yellow pins are states where you can be required to register as a sex offender under these HIV criminal laws. So I think the takeaways here are that HIV criminal laws are really more of the rule rather than the exception, and that they're not limited to any particular region of the United States. And the last thing I want to flag on the map is that we have these ongoing arrests and prosecutions that are also happening across the United States. We know that there have been hundreds over the last decade, but you should know that this number, 303, is by no means exhaustive. Tracking HIV-related prosecutions is actually quite challenging, and we're often stuck relying on sort of sensational or incomplete media reporting on these arrests and prosecutions. So as you just saw, over 30 states have some kind of HIV-specific law in place, including sentence enhancements for sex workers or people who share syringes. In general, the laws can be described as targeting sexual conduct or contact, broadly defined, along with exposure to bodily fluids, typically blood or saliva, but sometimes other things that don't really pose a risk of HIV transmission, like urine. So currently there are HIV criminal law reform efforts happening in some form in about a dozen states, or probably more at this point, ranging from Florida to Ohio to Washington state. And a very exciting recent development, we saw a modernization bill succeed in California just last month. And it's really my hope and expectation that the victory in California is going to inspire and galvanize even more advocacy to change these laws in different states. At the same time, while there is definitely, I think we can say, increasing attention to the movement to reform HIV criminal laws, we have to be mindful of the reality that most people living with HIV who are incarcerated or have been incarcerated didn't have that experience on account of an HIV-specific criminal prosecution for non-disclosure, right? And when people hear HIV criminalization, mostly what they think is laws criminalizing non-disclosure. So the toolkits are really intended to encourage a broader conception of HIV criminalization, including the criminalization of sex workers and people who use drugs, whether on the basis of HIV status or more generally. And you know, this is important because HIV criminal law reform really shouldn't be leaving these folks behind. And you know, I think it can be said that the HIV criminal law reform movement, while gaining momentum, is still, you know, in its relatively early stages. And so now is really the time to take an expansive view of what HIV criminalization is and take the stance that our reform efforts should be as inclusive as possible and don't exclude the people who experience the greatest harm from criminalization. And you're going to hear more from Kate, Sasanka, and Megan about the ways in which HIV criminalization intersects with criminalization of sex work and safe syringe access, but this map just gives you a quick snapshot of where there are HIV criminal laws specifically directed at sex workers, people who share syringes, or both. You can see that there are a range of states applying these enhanced penalties. In Missouri, Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina, there are penalty enhancements for both. So these are really the types of places that could benefit the most from more intersectional advocacy that is bringing these different communities together in pursuit of shared anti-criminalization goals. And with that, I'm going to leave it to the other Kate, Kate D, who's going to talk a bit more about sex work.
Yeah, just one point before we get to that is on that map, obviously, those are the states where sex work and drug use are sort of written into the HIV criminalization law that's on the books. But in all of the states, drug use and sex work are criminalized. So people living with HIV are targeted for those crimes, whether or not there's a particular piece of legislation that names HIV as a part of their statutory language. Anyway, sorry about that. Kate D, please take it away.
No, that's actually a perfect transition, so thank you for that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about generally how sex work is criminalized, and then in a couple slides we'll talk about the HIV specific pieces of this, but we kind of have to start around what it means to criminalize sex work. And so every single jurisdiction in the United States criminalizes sex work in some way. And outside of Nevada, it's basically criminalized all in the same way. We are the most criminalized country in the global north around the sex trade, where we criminalize every single aspect. So the selling of sexual services for resources is what is known as prostitution, and prostitution related crimes are under the umbrella of sex work, but it's not all sex work. So there are legal forms of sex work, but also a lot of those legal forms have different pieces and different requirements and different legalization structures around them, and some of which do involve HIV testing. We're not going to be talking about that today, but if you really delve into the relationship between the way that sex work is regulated, there's really important pieces around HIV beyond just what we're going to be talking about today. So with prostitution laws, so that means that in general, the buying and the selling aspects of sex work are criminalized. So they face some kind of penalties. Generally, you're talking about a misdemeanor, and the HIV piece is about upgrading that misdemeanor. It's also important to recognize that everyone around the sex worker is also criminalized through third-party or proxy laws. This means that things like promoting for the purposes of prostitution, where someone is helping you get clients, pandering, where someone is helping you get clients, other forms, anything that enables a person to work in the sex trade is included in this. And that can often mean really basic harm reduction is criminalized. Things like learning how to screen clients or watching out for each other or exchanging condoms becomes a criminal act when it furthers someone's ability to engage in sex work. Additionally, there is something, and this is actually a really important piece because it's so used in terms of criminalizing individuals that are trading sex, but loitering for the purposes of prostitution is a crime that does not require any physical contact. So what that is someone is engaging in a set of behaviors that an arresting officer assumes are related to that person trying to sell sex. So it could be anything from waving at cars to you're in a quote area known for prostitution, you're someone who has been arrested for loitering before, the way you're dressed, and it very often becomes a profiling crime. A lot of these behaviors, if you were a white cis man in your 50s wearing a suit, you're probably not going to be arrested for loitering for the purposes of prostitution. But if you are perhaps a woman of color, a trans woman, in a neighborhood that is associated with high levels of prostitution, so often in the place where you live, you can be arrested for loitering for the purposes of prostitution. And possession of harm reduction materials such as condoms have been used as evidence that a person is loitering for the purposes of prostitution. So I think the other thing that I really think is important to bring up is that while we're going to be talking about these really specific laws, policing practices that impact people and people who are trading sex or people profiled as such that reduce the ability to engage in harm reduction behaviors are really important when talking about the relationship between sex work and public health and HIV in particular. So there are efforts in the United States to move towards decriminalization. Decriminalization is pulling the laws specific to sex work off the books. It is not legalization, they're not interchangeable, but it's basically treating it as you would treat any other kind of formal or informal form of labor. In particular, DC just introduced a decriminalization bill for that city, and it is sitting in the city council right now. And it's really exciting to see a lot of these challenges move forward, because as much as we want to talk about HIV, we can definitely talk about how a lot of this is based exclusively on the criminalization of sex work. There's also legal challenges underway, and this is a really exciting lawsuit that I really encourage folks to look into. And it's where the Legal Aid Society of New York looked at all of the prostitution arrests in New York City, which is generally somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5,000 a year. And what they found was, in particular to the loitering statute, it was overwhelmingly women of color, trans women, and women who were system involved who were really being targeted, making up somewhere in the 80 to 90% range of who was being arrested for these crimes. And so they actually went after, and it's still moving through the courts right now, but it went after the loitering statute on the basis of the 14th Amendment, so equal protection under the law, and really talked about the impact of criminalization and the impact of a lot of these policing procedures on folks. There's also advocacy efforts that are moving forward. I know or I hope that folks have heard about Amnesty International supporting decriminalization. There's a lot of LGBTQ organizations out there that have been really amazing at coming out, talking about decriminalization of the sex trade. And then I included this because it was public health, and also it's very, very recent. I'm pretty sure they debated this somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 hours ago. But the American Medical Association is moving to use terminology around sex work as opposed to prostitute or prostitution when talking about the exchange of sexual services for resources. And so, you know, advocacy can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes it looks like policy, sometimes it looks like legal challenges to laws, but oftentimes it's also really about addressing the stigma and the discrimination that folks face when they're exchanging sex or when they're HIV positive. And the American Medical Association moving towards language that really affirms self-determination and the experience of sex work as labor is a really exciting move that is never going to get a lot of play in the media, but is also an incredibly important way to affirm that community and affirm working with that community. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Kate. And all of the people on this call are my personal heroes. So it's really exciting to get to hear them talk about this, because I feel like we spend a lot of time just being grouchy about the state of the world. So it's good to hear everyone speak from the work that they're doing, all the incredible and powerful work that they're doing. So I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about criminalizing drug and syringe use. So every single jurisdiction in the United States criminalizes drugs. Obviously they're all done in very different. The war on drugs is a historically noted racialized war that exists as a way to incarcerate poor folks, Black and brown folks, queer and trans folks, basically anyone who uses drugs in order to, supplement their health, to supplement interacting with systems like poverty and criminalization. Drugs are used frequently by people of all races, but the people most likely to be criminalized are Black and brown people, undocumented folks, anyone who the United States government or governments in general see as undesirable. So drug use is used as a proxy in order to view people as dirty or invaluable. Invaluable means valuable, and that's rude. But it's a way that we target communities utilizing drug use as a vector by which we can target them. And that is very, very similar and intersecting with the ways that we criminalize sex work and HIV. So it is one of the largest groups of arrests and charges made are on the basis of drug use. It's often used to sort of be a part of really racist and historically classist policing, such as broken windows policing, stop and frisk. A lot of those are structured around drugs and drug possession. And with syringes in particular, because 32 states criminalize the possession of paraphernalia, which includes syringes, regardless of whether or not you're carrying drugs on you or have drugs or in your system, carrying paraphernalia like syringes is a way that you can be targeted for drug use or being associated with drugs. So we are in a moment where the opioid crisis in particular has gained a lot of traction and visibility. So there has been increased interest in developing syringe service programs. Some people attribute this to the fact that a lot of white communities have been experiencing rampant overdose. Some people attribute it to the fact that there's a lot more global poverty visibility and a bunch of other things, but I think we can all agree that getting more syringe service programs is very much necessary. Syringe service programs aren't just talking about syringes, but they're also talking about other important tools like the supplies needed to inject in a safer way, including tourniquets and Band-Aids and clean water and a host of other supplies. We've seen some really successful campaigns from Virginia and Florida. Iowa has seen some really cool work happening with their syringe service programs, which is really fantastic. Drug users people who use drugs, drug users, people in recovery experience a lot of really, really interesting intersections with the HIV criminalization movement, because a lot of people contract HIV and hepatitis C, which I think is an important part of thinking about co-infection and HIV vulnerabilities through their incarceration. So it is often incarceration and criminalization of drug users is actually an indirect way to lead to people contracting HIV, which I think is really important to remember. So incarceration itself increases your vulnerability. And the criminalization of drugs is going to lead you there. With hepatitis C, you're also, because there aren't syringe service programs in all prisons, I might be wrong. I think there was one place that was organizing to get it, but I don't think it did. Syringe service program, there are no syringe service programs in prison, so the war on drugs in and of itself really hurts folks, even when we do have access to syringe service programs outside of jails and prisons, because once you're inside, you won't have access to them. It really is the indirect criminalization of people living with HIV and hepatitis C. Because so many of the people living with HIV were or are drug users, people who use drugs, we're getting a lot of indirect criminalization that I think what Kate said earlier, Kate B, is that we can't leave these people behind when we're talking about HIV criminalization, because people living with HIV are being criminalized for different ways that they interact with our carceral system and with supporting their lives, particularly for people who are poor or Black, who use drugs, who live with HIV. We're seeing all of these laws really specifically target them, even if it's not an HIV criminalization law. Criminalizing drug use is in and of itself a way to target people living with HIV, since such a high proportion of people living with HIV actually can and have used drugs. So that's the basic overview of why it's intersecting, which I'm sure many of you had already come to that conclusion before, but yeah.
Awesome. So, or not awesome, sorry. But thank you for that, Sasanka. And a lot of this is really going to be, I don't want to be duplicative about the way.
Kate?
Yeah?
Oh, your audio is just kind of going in and out.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to not duplicate, but definitely echo a lot of what's being said around the way that criminalization really does impact the same folks in a lot of the same ways. And because so much of this is based on really street-based and location-based policing, that's who really gets disproportionately impacted. So when we talk about these HIV criminalization laws, a lot of what we're talking about are called penalty enhancements. And so what happens is someone will be arrested for a prostitution-related crime, and in 12 states, if you are HIV positive and they can prove that you knew that, and they prove that through a handful of different ways, including things like possession of retroviral drugs, your misdemeanor becomes a felony, and a lot of times comes with a significantly higher prison sentence and significantly higher requirements post-release. And so 12 states have these kind of penalty enhancements for sex workers. And it's really important that when we do talk about HIV modernization laws, they are including these penalty enhancements, even though it's not really what gets talked about. First and foremost, most people who are affected by HIV-specific criminal incidents are engaged in sex work at the time. When folks are already involved in the system, it's a lot easier to slap on an aggravating offense and turn that into a felony than it is to find someone who's not necessarily involved in the system and who isn't going to be impacted by criminalization anyway. So in the Williams Institute did a really amazing report that looked at folks that were impacted by HIV-specific laws in California and found that 95% of those were engaged in sex work at the time. And because of the way that prostitution laws are generally enforced, of course, that's going to disproportionately impact, especially women of color. And in California, that was especially Black women. And we'll talk about it a little bit on the next slide, kind of how that breaks down by race. But it found that 4% of the, or Black women were 4% of the HIV positive women in California, but we're over 20% of arrests for felony solicitation, which is soliciting for the purposes of prostitution and getting that felony upgrade. And solicitation is one of those laws that does not require any contact. And so there's an article that came out in 2013 that looked at Nashville, Tennessee, and looked at the 52 criminal incidents, and also found that aggravated prostitution was a huge percentage of these. And what was interesting about the Tennessee study is that it actually looked at some of the behaviors that were recorded in the police reports and what people were being arrested for. And it was basically conversation. If you have a conversation where someone says, will you do X for $100, and you say yes, that is enough to get you a prostitution arrest. There's generally no discussion. A lot of them had sexual behaviors that had either incredibly low or no transmission, no chances for transmission. And a lot of those didn't actually go into any kind of detail whatsoever. And so you're talking about a crime that literally is just a conversation while HIV positive. And so if we go to the next slide, this is about the percent of folks living in California. And this will just kind of show you the breakdown of who is being disproportionately impacted by these laws. And a lot of this is really based on who's disproportionately impacted by prostitution laws. I love numbers. I'm kind of a huge nerd around data crunching. And Black women and Latino women are disproportionately impacted, overwhelmingly so, by arrest for prostitution-related laws in California. And so, pardon. So if you look at the bottom there, it'll show you that Black women make up 4% of the HIV positive, but 22% of the people impacted by this. But if you look at the prostitution-related arrests in California, I haven't done all the numbers for the last 10 years like this, but in 2014, Black women between the ages of 18 and 29 in one county made up 14% of prostitution-related arrests in California. And so when we look at this, we should not just look at it through the lens of HIV, we should look at it through the lens of criminalization, because this will tell you who's disproportionately impacted by those laws first. And so finally, kind of looking more generally at what are the intersections between sex work and HIV criminalization, because they go far beyond just these different pieces. So, we've talked a little bit about the felony upgrades for folks that are trading sex. And actually in Tennessee, up until 2 years ago, folks that had that arrest also were put on the highest level of the sex offender registry. So the ramifications of this, especially if you are HIV positive, you are living in Tennessee, you are on the sex offender registry, imagine what healthcare looks like. Imagine how many places you can go to actually get a continuum of care, especially, when you're talking about folks that are economically marginalized, when you're talking about parents. It really impacts the ability to even seek care. One of the other laws that we're not necessarily talking as much about today is mandatory testing of when people are arrested for prostitution-related crimes. And this is something that is not just true in prostitution, but the brothels in Nevada, the way that they're regulated is very often very frequent HIV testing, often at the cost of the person doing that work. And then a lot of these tests it's not necessarily covered by HIPAA. A lot of it goes to HIPAA provisions, but HIPAA doesn't talk about the criminal justice system. And so when a judge orders a mandatory test, or when the Department of Health does a mandatory test, and that goes in your record, all of a sudden that becomes information that is available to a lot more people than you and the person you're testing, and the person who tested you. In Nevada, for example, the local Department of Health was working with local police forces. So when they were doing sting operations, rapid testing people as they were arrested, including things that were just ticketable offenses. And so in those scenarios, who gets access to that information, what it looks like to get a ticket and to get a mandatory HIV test, which might go on your record, all of that is still really up in the air, and it's a pretty gray area as to how that actually breaks out. Second, it's really, as we keep saying, people of color, LGBTQ folks, people living with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness and poverty are always disproportionately impacted by criminalization. And so they're therefore going to be disproportionately impacted by HIV criminalization as well. Next, you know, a lot of these laws really promote a lot of stigma about HIV. And that is something that really is important to talk about, especially at the intersections where you're talking about stigmatized individuals. It's not just a stigma about HIV, it's a stigma about being a vector of disease. And that's, and especially when you're talking about, you know, sex workers who engage with other people, all of a sudden there's this idea that being HIV positive and trading sex means you're out to hurt people. In New York, so the Access to Condoms campaign in New York was about banning banning the use of condoms as evidence of prostitution. And right now, there's no state that outright bans it. There's a couple different cities that do. But in New York State, we were trying to pass a law and got it through one of the houses, but not the other. But I'll never forget that we were really excited that it got passed through that house. But the very last person to vote on it while they were giving their vote specifically said, I'm not doing this for people that trade sex. I'm doing it for the wives of their clients who need to be protected. And it really feeds into this idea that when we're talking about sex workers and HIV, we're talking about a stigmatized population, and we're talking about a stigmatized population that is assumed to be spreading disease and causing harm. Where, you know, when they actually look at the numbers, sex workers are not the fastest growing HIV population and have generally lower rates of HIV than a lot of other populations. But this association is really prominent, and it is really furthered by a lot of this stuff. And the negative public health consequences are pretty serious. The way that we criminalize sex work decreases your ability to engage in harm reduction. It means that you're less likely, if you're policed for condoms, if you're in an area where you know that a condom is going to get you arrested, people are less likely to carry condoms. When you have access to rights, when you have access to labor rights, when you have control over your body and the way that you work, condom use becomes a regular practice. It becomes the default practice. And this has been shown across the globe. UNAIDS is in support of decriminalization of sex work. The Global Commission on HIV and the Law is in support of decriminalization of sex work. Criminalization of sex work promotes not just stigma, not just violence, not just harm, but it really has sincere negative health consequences for people that trade sex.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I think what you said about people considering sex workers vectors of disease is something that Trevor Logan once said, is that sex workers should be considered vectors of education, not vectors of disease. And that's always stuck with me, because sex workers have a really vested interest in their health, as do people who use drugs, which people seem to forget. So thank you so much, Kate. In terms of syringe access and the intersections, so there are 12 states that specifically criminalize sharing of syringes and other injection equipment by people living with HIV. And it's unclear how many people have been prosecuted under those laws, but it is also really negative incentive to actually carry around injection equipment. So the way that, if many of you have not worked in a syringe exchange or know exactly how a syringe exchange works, basically most of them work, and syringe exchange is a little bit different than syringe access, but most of them work by you return a certain amount of syringes and you get handed a certain amount of syringes based on how many you turned in. And the percentages really vary by state and by county and by city, and they all operate really differently. But the essential premise, right, with a syringe exchange, it's not the same as syringe access, which is better because it doesn't require a specific amount of exchange, which, you know, limits our ability to distribute safer supplies. We really discourage people from keeping syringes on their possession, whether they're used or new, if we criminalize drug possession. Paraphernalia possession. And this is a really big disincentive towards what we know is an evidence-based practice, which is us, you know, using safer works and what some people call clean works, using new works, is a great way to keep yourself from contracting HIV or from transmitting HIV or hepatitis C to another person. And it really disincentivizes you carrying works to an exchange. It disincentivizes you getting new works. It's much more safe for you from a criminalization perspective to keep your use restricted to a place where you might not be able to have clean waters or other types of clean injection equipment. So it really is just bad public health practice, which we know is also true of HIV criminalization, where we're encouraging things in the law because we've morally codified them in some way. We've made some sort of moral equivocation that doesn't actually do the things that we need it to do. And that is certainly true with syringe exchange. In Washington, D.C., since implementing a syringe exchange, we've seen a drastic drop of HIV new infections among injection drug users. I think over 75%, might be closer to 80 or 85%. There were 7 new infections in D.C. last year of people who use drugs, injecting drugs, which is ridiculous considering that Washington, D.C. has an HIV prevalence rate of 1.9%, which is double what you would consider an epidemic rate. So it's a really evidence-based practice that's working really well. But in many other jurisdictions, moral codification of what we consider to be enabling people's use has stopped us from actually doing good public health practice. It disproportionately harms people of color, particularly Black and brown people, LGBTQ people. People use drugs for lots and lots of different reasons, and people use needles for lots of different reasons. So I worked at a syringe exchange for 2 years, and people also traded their needles for using hormones. So a lot of our clients who were LGBTQ, particularly trans individuals, bought hormones on the street, and they used needles that they bought on the street. And our exchange provided needles for hormone use. And those things can also be technically criminalized. And as we know, lawmakers don't always have a great understanding of what people might be using needles for. So carrying needles in and of itself could be considered reason to arrest you on a paraphernalia charge, even if they aren't being used for drugs, which is a whole other horrifying aspect. And we need to be keeping people safer. So being able to use new needles for hormones is just as important as it is for being able to use new needles for drug use as well. And of course, stigma promotion is a huge part of this. There's so much stigma around using drugs, whether that's like false narratives around how addiction works, or the ways that people can or cannot use certain drugs more safely, what kind of race of people use drugs. And those are all codified by current syringe access laws, particularly if we look at laws like the drug use laws around having different ratios for crack and cocaine. That doesn't particularly always work with what we're talking about with injection and syringes. But even those disparities, we codify disparity into the law all the time. And right now, injection drug use, we're seeing a lot of people saying, oh, we'll take care of people who got addicted to prescription pills, but once they've transitioned into using injection drugs, they're too far gone. Injection is seen as sort of the last step in drug use chaos, whereas for many different reasons, whether injecting could be your best option as opposed to smoking or snorting. And there's a way that injection in and of itself is considered this pariah in drug use, whereas it's not necessarily evidence-based at all. I actually was reading a pamphlet from an anti-drug, drug education campaign. I think it was from Drug Free World. And this is a literal quote from this booklet. You can see it on my Instagram because I could not believe it. It said, if you use a small amount of drugs, then it's a stimulant. And the more drugs you use, then it becomes a depressant or an opioid. It was so unbelievable, the bad drug laws and the bad understanding that we have of drugs. And it said similar things about, once you've started to inject drugs, that's when somebody is so far gone. We see similar things about meth. So really what we need to be talking about is, separating the truth from the lies. And I think that is a huge intersection that syringe access has with sex work decrim as well as HIV decrim, which is that there are just lies. There are so many things that are just lies in how we talk about people who use drugs and how drugs work. So we can go to the next slide. And I think I'm slated to talk about this, but of course anyone can jump in here. The laws enforce and reflect stigma and discrimination, and in such like powerful ways where even if people aren't being prosecuted under the laws that we've been talking about today, which many of them are, but also many aren't, they encourage really bad health practices and really, really bad ways of interacting with medical systems and legal systems where people aren't using new needles because they are afraid of being incarcerated or arrested, where people aren't carrying condoms, where people aren't getting tested because of the laws, regardless of whether they be prosecuted or not. Laws are a way that we say as a society what we're invested in. And we're saying we're not invested in your health. We're more invested in you adhering to a moral code that we've set as a precedent. And it completely contradicts all of the evidence-based public health efforts. And of course, we particularly, I know a lot of, this was a collaboration between Center for HIV Law and Policy and National LGBTQ Task Force. And I think that's really, really important to note, and that there are ways that LGBTQ communities of color have consistently seen their bodily autonomy undermined by legal systems. And this is a place where we can see 3 separate ways that bodily autonomy continues to be undermined, where we try and tell people how and what they can do with their bodies, what they can put in their bodies, what they are able to use their bodies for, and criminalizing that and saying like, this is what you put in your body or what you use your body for is a criminalizable offense. And it's something that we can literally remove you from society for and make it more difficult than anything for you to re-enter into society for. So these are sort of the commonalities that I see, and I'd love for anyone else on the call to jump in about that.
Thank you so much. I think there are so many commonalities, and you know, I listen to you all speak all the time, and every time I do, I learn something new. So thank you so much. And one of the last things we wanted to touch on this call is about how advocacy communities are sometimes inadvertently undermining each other, despite how similar these, or how intersectional these 3 issues are, how they come together and how they're sort of playing off one another. We tend to hear folks in the advocacy communities using examples or doing work that unintentionally is having negative consequences on the other kind of groups of folks. So we've got, if you go to the next slide, we've got a couple of examples of where we've seen this happen, and then we'd love to hear from folks on the call if you've seen this happen, or if you've seen people doing the opposite, doing well in working in intersections between these three issue areas. So one of them, you know, we had a legislator who had agreed to sponsor a bill to modernize the HIV criminal law, who then backed out because they said it would conflict with a syringe access bill that was already in the pipeline. So they saw this connection too between HIV criminal laws and syringe access laws, but saw those as something where only one of them could happen at a time. And obviously the advocates involved in this, there was no intention that these 2 bills be thought of in contention with each other. So it was definitely an unintended consequence. We had another, personally had an instance where I was on a panel speaking in front of an audience, and another person on the panel with me said, you know, obviously not all behaviors related to HIV should go without consequence. Obviously, if someone stabs someone else with a syringe, someone living with HIV stabs someone else with a syringe, they should go to jail. And I've heard that example used quite a number of times. And again, it's not that there's bad intention behind using that as an example. It's definitely an example that is, you know, it strikes people as an outlier. But again, it's having an unintended consequence on people who are doing advocacy around syringe use. And finally, the last last example we brought up here is when, you know, we hear bill sponsors often say, you know, we're comfortable with modernizing this bill, but we can't reform the piece around the targeting of people engaged in sex work because, you know, that's a non-starter, or that's too radical, or that's too complicated for our membership. And so all of these are, and often the compromise to, the decision to compromise and drop the advocacy around people engaged in sex work is often made by people who are not themselves directly impacted by that law. And so, you know, there's definitely 1,000 more examples of where these groups are coming into contention, often unintentionally, when in fact we feel like the work would be so much better if folks were working on all three of these issues together or with a common outcome in mind. And it seems like a lot of the folks who are on this webinar are doing just that. So we'd love to hear about success stories of people having successful collaborations, or hear about other pitfalls that you've seen come up. So we've got another magical poll. I don't know how to make it come up. Oh, brilliant. There's 3 questions in this poll. They ask, are you aware of any intersectional advocacy in your community or elsewhere across HIV criminalization, criminalization of sex work, and safe syringe access? The second question asks if you're aware of examples where there was tension or conflict between these different advocacy communities. And the third asks if you, what ways you've seen that overcome intercoalition challenges between these different communities. And if this format of the quick poll doesn't work as well for you, you can also type into, I think there's a chat box as well. Am I lying about that, Arpia?
No, that's true. Yeah, the third question, since it kind of calls for like open response, you can use the text box, or you can use the raise your hand feature, and then you can actually share your experience or thoughts over audio as well.
And of course, I always just want to say that please, if you have a question or a thought that's outside of this this poll, we'd love to hear that too. So don't feel limited. Arpita, do we have any early poll results? You know how I get excited about exit polling.
Okay, sorry. I was muted in 2 different areas, so I had to find the way to unmute myself. So some early poll results. For question 1, we have 88% of people who've answered the poll so far saying yes, they are aware of intersectional advocacy in their communities or elsewhere across these 3 areas of work, which is incredible. For question 2, we have 59% of people who have answered so far saying yes, they're aware of examples where there was tension and conflict between these advocacy communities. And definitely in the second question, it's a much closer divide between yes and no. And I'm seeing people typing into the chat box. I don't know if you panelists want to address some of the things that they're saying.
I can't see the chat box, but it's probably because I'm bad at stuff. Oh no, I figured it out.
Okay, I was going to say if you go down, you can toggle, and there's a button that says chat. If you click on it, it should show up.
So one person has stressed education and education opportunities that combine these different areas. So they share that there was a session on needle exchange at a North Carolina Trans Health Summit, and that sex worker advocacy was a part of the presentation.
That's so good to hear. I'm hearing more and more instances where people are making these connections and really doing this work intentionally in a cross-sectional way. So great.
So based on the poll, it seems like a great deal of you are in fact aware of some intersectional advocacy happening in your community across these 3 areas of work. So if you want to share that with the group, you can either raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can go ahead and type it into the chat box.
We have one respondent who's raised another intersection, that between HIV and immigration, or HIV criminalization and crimmigration, and their frustration that there's a lack of intentional work around these particular challenges and the challenge faced by an immigrant living with HIV.
This is Sasanka. I think that's so important. And I saw a statistic that isn't worth anything because I don't know what the source is, but I will try and find it. And actually, Kate, either of the Kates might know this, but something like 94% of immigrants who have been criminalized for HIV were soliciting at the time that they were charged for it, or that was like how the conduit by which they received the charge. So I think it's I've worked with and I know Kate D at least, we work together a lot on sex work, and migration is such a huge part of that, especially for folks who are undocumented migrants and experiencing a lack of inability to find employment. Sex work is a huge way that people are employed by that. And then they experience these many binds because of just police being around sex workers' roles. So this is a huge part of criminalization of sex work, is it doesn't even matter if the charges stick, because the police are always around and they can find a way to charge you with something. So the criminalization of sex work creates the conditions under which people are being surveilled. And Kate probably has a lot more to say about that.
No, I think talking about sex work in migrant populations is a really important issue because, Zanka, you're absolutely right. Sex work, and this is true across the board, sex work is a means of survival for marginalized folks, and it always has been. And it always will be. And so it's really important to look at the ways that migrants are being targeted through either sting operations that are focused on really specific areas of different cities, the way that sting operations target massage parlors and target the Asian community, and doing and prostitution. If you get a prostitution charge, it is a deportable offense, or if you are a legal permanent resident, it is a bar to you adjusting your status. Or if you're on a visa, it'll prevent you from becoming a legal permanent resident. And so it's a major, major issue that has a lot of different factors to it, and is a really important intersection to really to talk about and to highlight. So thank you for bringing it up.
Totally. I would say, I think it's part of this paradigm shift of talking about the ways that people living with HIV are having intersections with oppressive systems like the immigration enforcement system and the criminal legal system, instead of trying to think the other way around of where can we find HIV in statutes, right? So I'm so glad you brought that up, and definitely I think a place where we need to keep broadening this frame out to talk about the ways that people living with HIV are experiencing these systems. Thank you so much for that.
So I wish we could continue this conversation, because it's been such a fantastic discussion, and people have raised wonderful examples illustrating some of the ways in which these issues interface. I do want to respect your time, though. So we'll just quickly close with a few suggestions about how you can promote more intersectional advocacy in your own work, although it sounds like so many of you a lot of you are already doing that. So first, we really urge you to use and share the toolkits. They contain a lot of the information that we covered in this presentation. And they also include a sort of more advocacy-focused section on concrete sort of tips and strategies. I think a necessary first step to widening the scope of your advocacy is to get an idea of what else is already happening in your community and state. So what else is happening and how does it reflect the goals and values that you are working on, and how can you be supporting the work of others and making sure your own advocacy and coalitional spaces are welcoming and inclusive. This really goes hand in hand with trying to shift away from a very narrow focus on getting a bill through that targets HIV non-disclosure. Those are, of course, incredibly awful laws and they require reform, but we also need to be considering all of the other ways in which HIV status is criminalized in a given state, right? And all of these other systemic drivers of incarceration for people living with HIV that are not necessarily, you know, HIV-specific laws. And finally, you know, we encourage, both for ourselves and others, mindfulness in our own advocacy and in our working relationships, whether that's your sort of strategy or whether that's simple things like the language that you use, making sure that we're not inadvertently stigmatizing sex workers or people who use drugs and or excluding those communities in the work that we're doing. So Kate, Sysanka, or Megan, did you want to add anything here?
Thank you, Kate.
No, just thank
That's
you.
kind of
Yeah.
quick and dirty. But
yeah, thank you. And thank you for everyone who joined and gave your time and who is working on this in your communities.
yeah, and I just have our contact information. Please reach out to any one of us if you'd like to talk more about the toolkits or about the conversation that we had today. I know that the discussion could have continued, you know, a lot longer than it did, but I'm so glad that you were able to join.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining this webinar. Again, as Kate said, if you have any questions or want to continue the discussion, email any of these panelists. Thanks for joining. Have a great rest of your day.